Welcome to this video presentation by Victoria Barr and Ryan Gravestock on the Sandoz chemical spill. So the Rhine River was turned red from water runoff from a large chemical fire, warehouse 954. The warehouse in question was used to store pesticides, mercury and other poisonous chemicals. This happened in the Schweizerhalle industrial complex in Basel, Switzerland on the 1st of November 1986. The industrial complex was owned by Sandoz company, which is a pharmaceutical chemical company. The Rhine River, where the chemicals were spilled, goes through Switzerland, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. The history of the Sandoz company is that it became Novartis after a merger between Sandoz and a secondary company in 1996. The pharmaceutical company was founded in 1886 and is known for developing Sandimmune for organ transplants, Clozaril and Serentil, both for psychiatric disorders, as well as two others for headache migraines. Between the world wars, Sandoz produced chemicals for the textiles, leather and paper industries, and in 1939 began producing agricultural chemicals such as fertilizers. The labs are also accredited with the discovery of the psychedelic effects of LSD. Sandoz went on to produce LSD until 1965, after it became marketed recreationally instead of for the treatment of mental illnesses, including alcoholism and sexual infidelity. Warehouse 954 was not designed to house the volatile substances. The warehouse was not fitted with a sprinkler system nor smoke detectors, and it was originally designed to house heavy machinery. In the event of a fire, there were no extra precautions to prevent the spreading, and the safety system was not operated fully at the point of the fire, and the safety systems that were in use that night were rendered useless by the sheer amount of water that had to be used to put out the fire. So the initial ignition has not been proved, but it's theorized that it happened during the packing process of the dye Prussian blue, which would have occurred during the shrink wrapping process when a blowtorch is passed over to shrink wrap the plastic, and if it's held too long, the dye catches fire, which it catches fire at 140 degrees Celsius. Prussian blue burns with a slight glow that is difficult to detect, so that by the time the fire was detected, it was too late. Despite Prussian blue containing cyanide groups, it's regarded as non-toxic due to the cyanide groups being bound to the central iron. Along with Prussian blue, stored in the warehouse were numerous chemicals, including phosphoric acid, which is toxic to living organisms in the river, such as fish, birds, humans and plants, rodenticides, usually insoluble in water, although they would be likely to harm aquatic life, herbicides, which are highly soluble and would have contaminated all the water supplies, as well as killed many aquatic plants and contaminated the soil around the river, leaving the fish in the river without a food source. Fungicides are known to have a negative impact on organisms living in soils, such as earthworms, as well as causing skin irritation in humans. Emulsifiers, which are used to aid two liquids in mixing together and often used in food. They are known to lower the surface tension in water, which can cause issues for some aquatic life. Dodecyl benzene causes irritation in humans and should not be ingested. 3-aminoacetanilide, which is an irritant and should not be released into the environment, as well as aminosulfonic acid, monoethylamine, which also should not be released into the environment, both of which can be inferred as toxic. Along with the previously mentioned chemicals, mercury was in the warehouse. Roughly 130 kilos to 200 kilos are estimated to have been washed into the river, as well as infiltrating 11 meters below ground level into the soil. It is extremely toxic to the environment and a known neurotoxin. It can accumulate in water and forms methyl mercury, which enters the food chain through small fish, working its way up and eventually reaching humans and causing mercury poisoning, as well as being incredibly harmful to pregnant women. So during the fire, large amounts of firefighting water were used in order to fight the blaze. This overflowed the retention basins, and the mixture of chemicals turned the water red due to the red dye. The full safety system was not in operation, and after the fire was put out and the warehouse was destroyed, around 2,700 tons of materials had to be disposed of. So in regards to lasting impact, the Swiss government put in place the Major Accidents Ordinance and the Chemical Safety Inspectorate, meaning larger retention basins needed to be built for all chemical storage units, and combustible materials and reactants had to be stored separately. The Rhine Action Plan of 1987, or better known as the Salmon 2000, resulted in a reduction of pollution from phosphorus and nitrates by 50%, and in other pollutants from 80 to 100%. This act also led to the return of salmon in the Rhine by 1997, which is very good as it is 3 years ahead of schedule, and salmon are very sensitive to pollution in waterways. The Rhine 2020 Act aimed to have the river clean enough for humans to swim in by 2020, and all chemical companies were required to increase all safety precautions in the area. So the overall environmental and business impacts. On the environmental side, initially there could be reported a foul smell of rotting eggs as well as burning rubber, and all locals had to stay inside and keep their windows closed. Throughout the Rhine River, the 400 kilometers in length, 500,000 fish were killed, rendering some species extinct. Chemicals reached the North Sea after 10 days and fishing was suspended. 3 months after the initial fire, some species did begin returning to the river, but it took a total of 6 years for the area around the warehouse to begin recovering. However, in a good light, the ecosystem, due to heavy monitoring by the government and companies alike, was able to recover and is doing better than it has in 40 years. No human death is linked to the incident, although 14 people were treated at the hospital, and the incident itself reversed 10 years of cleanup. On the business side, Sandoz had to develop a new framework for warehouse safety. An internal report was carried out by the West Germans chemicals industry. All water processing plants along the river had to be shut down, and bottled water was handed out to civilians. It can be assumed that Sandoz had to pay fines for the damage done to the Rhine. However, there was little information available on this topic. I will now hand over to Ryan, who is going to go through the risk assessment.
When assessing risk, we need to consider the effect on the environment, especially the life in the Rhine River, workers in warehouse 954, and if things spiral out of control, civilians of Schweizenhalle. Now with each possible risk, it will be given a risk rating between 1 and 25, 1 being low risk and 25 being high risk. This can be calculated using a 1 to 5 scale for the severity of the risk and the likelihood of the risk, 1 being very unlikely or minor injury, and 5 being fatality or certainty. If the risk rating is 4 or less, it is considered low risk and no action is needed to change its activity. If the risk rating is between 5 and 9, it is considered medium risk, and an improvement is needed in regards to risk reduction and a time frame is needed to implement the changes. Any risk rating above 9, the activity must stop or restricted as much as possible, and immediate improvement is needed. This table gives us a lot of valuable information regarding the chemicals stored in the Sandoz warehouse and how much was stored. It also provides the estimated amount of chemicals that are either burned or due to the firemen washed into the river Rhine. In addition, it provides the measured or calculated concentration of each chemical in the river Rhine at village Neuf in micrograms per liter and is compared to the lethal concentration to kill 50% of the rainbow trout and other fish, with a separate column for the lethal concentration to kill 50% of Daphnia, a common water flea. Using this table, we can determine that the Rhine contained over twice the emtrophos to kill 50% of the rainbow trout, and over 13 times the amount to kill 50% of the Daphnia. There was also 1 to 10 times the amount of formothion for rainbow trout. There was also possibly 4 times the concentration of mercury needed to kill 50% of the fish, and over 5 times for Daphnia. This also shows just how much more lethal mercury is in comparison to other metal-based pesticides, as the concentration of zinc in the Rhine river would need to be up to 14 times the concentration, taking the worst case scenario values, to kill 50% of the fish, showing that zinc is around 24 to 250 times less lethal than mercury to the fish. It is a much safer compound to use as a worker and safer for the environment if it is incorrectly disposed of. The main issue when talking about risk and potential harm is that every hazard involving a fire is made worse by the fact that the warehouse has no safety equipment when dealing with fires, because there are no sprinklers, no smoke detectors, making the likelihood of each fire larger than it should be. The only way of knowing there was a fire is if a worker saw it or smelled the smoke. Unfortunately, the fire was initially hard to see and produced barely any visible smoke. If smoke detectors were installed along with sprinklers, the colourless smoke would have been detected and sprinklers or another method of fire extinction could have been triggered along with a fire brigade being contacted. Another method of prevention was using a heat gun instead of a blowtorch for the process of using heat to shrink the plastic around the chemicals that would be eventually stored in the warehouse, since the open flame of the blowtorch is what most likely caused the Prussian blue to ignite in the first place. Additionally, the workforce should have been warned about the colourless flame of Prussian blue. A lot of chemicals stored in Warehouse 954 are understandably harmful to the environment, since most of them are designed to be a type of killing method for different purposes, so they all become very harmful for the ecosystem if the chemicals make it out into the environment. Some of these chemicals are very dangerous to humans, especially the mercury-based pesticides. Since they are aqueous, the mercury is more easily absorbed by the skin than in its elemental form. If enough mercury is absorbed, it can cause mercury poisoning, resulting in permanent damage to the brain, kidneys, and a developing fetus. That is why full PPE should be worn, including goggles, masks, gloves, and fully covered skin. Pregnant women should not be working or enter into the chemical storage warehouse. On top of full PPE, an eye wash station should also be installed into the warehouse in the rare case of any chemicals making it past the goggles and into the eye. This is especially the case with 4,6-dinitro-orthocresol. In the case of the eye being contaminated with DNOC, room temperature water should be run into the eye for 15 minutes, and if any symptoms persist, seek a health care facility. Thank you for listening and watching this presentation.